Welcome to the Explore Words, Discover Worlds podcast, presented by Bradford Literature Festival. In this episode, delve into the thrilling world of crime fiction as we are joined by acclaimed authors Vaseem Khan, Alex Gray and Sarah Hussain to discuss their gripping novels, each set in a different corner of the globe. Recorded live at the 2024 Bradford Literature Festival, connect with the minds behind some of the most compelling crime fiction and uncover the secrets lurking across borders.
Welcome to this event, ladies and gentlemen. Now, the sharper-eyed amongst you will have realized that there are not four people sitting up here, as has been advertised. We've managed to lose the chair of this panel, but it is a crime fiction event, so that's par for the course, I guess. There's now a £10,000 reward for anyone who can find Saida. But if she turns up, we'll bring out another chair. But in her absence, I have volunteered, or been volunteered, I should say, to chair this panel, but I'll also be talking about my own book. So my name's Vaseem Khan, but I'll start by allowing our other panelists to introduce themselves. So perhaps we could have quick intros to you both. Sarah, do you want to start?
Hi, I'm Dr. Sarah Hussain, and I am the author of In the Foothills of the Himalayas, and I'm going to be talking about my eco-thriller today.
Hello, I'm Alex Gray, and I'm the author of the Detective Lorimer series, which is mostly set in Scotland, but the current one partly in Zimbabwe.
And I'm Vaseem Khan, and I am the author of the Malabar House novels, which are set in 1950s India, just after Indian independence, and they introduce India's first female police detective, who's working with an English forensic scientist who's based out in Bombay. And we'll talk about each of the books in turn, but just to go back to the title of this session. So we are the Globe Plotters. Very nice, very droll title. International Perspectives in Crime Fiction. And I happen to be the chair of the UK Crime Writers Association, which is the oldest and the largest association of crime writers in the country. It's 70 years old now, and I'm the first non-white person to chair that. And I think that reflects very much the title of this session, the fact that crime fiction in particular, more so than many other genres in publishing, has opened itself up, has broadened itself out to voices from around the world. And this is particularly visible in not just in books, but if you turn on your TV and if you turn on Netflix or Amazon Prime, you have crime shows from all over the world, crime shows from India, thrillers from Korea, from Japan. And I think this, more than anything, is the change that I've seen for over the last decade since I was first published. Why don't you guys introduce the books now? Introduce the books that you want to focus on today. So give us the 60-second elevator pitch for...
Out of Darkness is the 21st story in the Inspector Lorimer series. Well, he's actually now a superintendent. And it features an African, Daniel Cohey, who came to Glasgow several books ago as a refugee. He had been a police inspector in Zimbabwe. And on this occasion, Lorimer, my detective, has gone on holiday to Zimbabwe, and he's hoping to locate Daniel's mother. Daniel left Zimbabwe under a cloud, in fact, under a fire. His house was burned down, his wife and son murdered, and he had to escape as a refugee, something that really has happened to people. They've come to Scotland. So I know quite a lot about refugees in Zimbabwe. I was married there a very, very long time ago.
Wow. Sarah, so first of all, your background is you have a PhD. So just give us a quick summary of the PhD, because it's relevant to the novel that you've written.
I did a PhD, a multidisciplinary one at Huddersfield. My research was really, when I grew up, I never really saw myself represented in literature. And therefore, my research was really about rediscovering those women who were kind of, they weren't really part of the history. So when I began my PhD, I was looking into post-colonialism, not just the social and political, colonization in India, but actually the environmental colonization. So the story starts in when Gandhi returns from South Africa, the British Raj era. And I was just telling Vaseem earlier that when I was doing my research, all the books that I read, which were set in the British Raj era, were actually, there was no South Asian women who were represented in those novels. They were all authors written by, European authors. And the South Asian women were just completely invisible. And for somebody who's grown up in the UK, I felt that there were no role models. So when I did my research, I discovered these amazing women who were aware, who were aware of forest knowledge. They were actually activists. So I decided after that research that I wanted to write a novel to raise awareness and give voice to those women. And thus I wrote a very exciting eco-thriller, which I hope you will have the opportunity to read.
Well, tell us what makes it exciting. Give us the plot. Give us a quick...
Well, it's about the women who save the trees, so I don't want to give the story away.
No.
But it's about a London-based agent who he extorts commercial pine trees. And when I did my research, what happened was I discovered that the ecologically appropriate pine trees in the region, they have what you call a wide leaf, a banja leaf. And when that leaf falls to the ground, it creates a leaf mold deposit. So when the rain falls, it prevents the rain and landslides. And what happened was the English traders chopped these ecologically appropriate trees down and replaced them with commercial pine. Now, at the time, these women, they were aware of the importance of these trees in order to save the region and to stop the landslides. So what they did was they began a non-violent protest. Now, Martin Luther King and Gandhi and a lot of men were celebrated for this non-violent activism, but it was actually these women who were going on what you call satyagraha, and they were going on non-violent activism. So really the story, the first part is set with the father Barraj, who is he's on this struggle, an anti-colonial struggle, and you're learning about what it really feels like, not from the colonizer, but from the indigenous voice, or what it feels like to be in the Raj era. But then it takes over into the second part of the novel, which was essential for me to understand how Vidya's born, and then we see her fight in order to try to save these trees, really, because she's got this passion that she wants to save the land. And I think what makes it different is the fact that this novel is drawing attention to the women's activism, and it's just really exciting. There's a subplot to do with an untouchable girl, because if I was going to talk about social justice for one group of women, it was essential for me to also consider, what it was like to be a Dalit girl in that community as well.
Absolutely. And as for myself, the first book in my India set series is called Midnight at Malabar House, and it's in 1950. It's just a few years after Indian independence, the horrors of partition. Gandhi's now been assassinated. India is the world's largest democracy, 300 million Indians, and it's 1.5 billion Indians now, so you can see how busy they've been in the last 70-odd years. And into this environment, I introduced India's first female police detective, Persis. She's from a Parsi community, so she's not a Hindu or a Muslim. She's from a very small community, but a very wealthy and influential community that prospered during the Raj, because they worked very well with the British. She qualifies. Nobody knows what to do with her, so they put her in Bombay's smallest police station, called Malabar House Station, with a whole bunch of other rejects and misfits. And then the murder of a senior English diplomat who's in Bombay falls into her lap, and she has to solve it, working with this English forensic scientist, Archie Blackfinch, who's out there in Bombay. And the book essentially looks at this very turbulent period following 300 years of the British presence in India. And the reason I wanted to write that particular period is one, that nobody had looked at that period in any great depth. There's only one well-known book, and that's a literary novel called A Suitable Boy that focused on that era. Otherwise, it's never really been explored very well. And nobody had said a crime novel in that space. And it allowed me to tackle lots of issues that I'm very interested in, because I was born and I grew up here, but my parents are from the subcontinent. And in 1997, just after university, I got the opportunity to work out in India. And I spent 10 amazing years watching this country transform from the almost pre-industrial economy to the near global superpower that we think of India as today. But one of the things that I saw, so you had all of these amazing things, westernization and globalization happening, and call centers, of which you've all been the beneficiaries, I'm sure, at some point. But you also had these enormous legacy problems. You had caste prejudice and poverty on a scale that you can't imagine in this country. And so I wanted to write about all of those things. Where does that modern India come from? It comes in a large part from that period just after India became independent. Many of the things that we see in modern India today are a direct result of the partition of India and the shadow that has cast over the country for so very long, and all of the other things that happened at that period. So
I think that's a really interesting point that you've made. That, I mean, A Suitable Boy is really a historical literary novel, but I think the importance of crime fiction, I think you'll both agree, because you're using history. I think it's Val McDermid who said a long time ago that crime fiction holds up a mirror to society in a way that no other genre does.
yeah, well, let's take your books now. Is it 22 books into this series?
That's
now?
the 21st.
21st.
I'm nearly finished 22. I've got an idea for 23.
You've taken your protagonist through not only space but through time over 2 decades, because you write one book a year.
That's right.
And throughout those books, you have used the lens of crime fiction to look at the society at that particular point in time and space. So what's the journey that your protagonists has
I think
made?
the journey for my protagonist is finding out even more about human nature. And I think my own interest in human nature started when I was very young. I think by the time I was 14 and reading The Russians, Crime and Punishment obviously was a great spur.
And a very funny book that people don't realize that how funny Crime and Punishment is.
Yeah, it's a very, very interesting book because you're looking into the psyche of the perpetrator as much as what happens to the investigation. So I think I've always been interested in what makes people do the things they do. I visit prisons a great deal in Scotland and speak
For
to...
fun?
Usually for helping rehabilitation, doing workshops, things like that, giving them readings, occasionally for research. One or two of my books, well, quite a few of my books have got elements of prison in them. I think with Lorimer, having gone through different cases, he's come across different aspects of the city of Glasgow, where I was born and brought up and educated. And I think with all big cities, there's a different facet. It's not just black and white. It's not just the good side of the tracks and the other side of the tracks. There are so many different aspects. So I deal with the city as a place of great art and literature, and music, business, all sorts of things like that. In one of the books, I look at the red light district, and I also look at politics. I'll tell you a funny wee story about that book. It's called A Pound of Flesh. I think it was the 10th book in the series. And after the book was published, my late brother-in-law phoned me up and said, "I've just seen your book on television." I said, "It's never been televised." "Oh, what do you mean?" "Oh," he said, "I've been watching the Scottish news, and they were interviewing Nicola Sturgeon, who at that time was the Deputy First Minister of Scotland. And she had your book on her bookshelf behind her. And I thought this was very, very funny because in that particular book, I bump off a fictional Deputy First Minister of Scotland.
Maybe that's why she had it on her.
Yeah.
Maybe that's why she had it on her shelf.
Yeah, well, she loves crime fiction, as it
She does
happens.
indeed. She does.
So with every different book, I deal with a different aspect. When Glasgow was hosting the Commonwealth Games, for instance, that book dealt very, very much with human trafficking.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that was back in 2014. I was researching that book about 2012, and there was almost nothing in the media or the press about human trafficking. And even then, it was the third largest organised crime in the UK. Very, very little on the papers. And by the time the book came out, a couple of years, it was beginning to be noticed. I think Lorimer is wanting to solve crimes, obviously, but he's also wanting justice for different people he meets.
Yeah.
And I think I'm a bit like that myself.
Yeah, and I think all the best detectives that we read have a social conscience as well as a detective.
Yeah.
a will
They're looking
to
for
solve
justice for
crimes.
their victims and the families of
Yeah.
victims.
So Sarah, what made you want to go from PhD and presumably a career in academia, perhaps, to want to write a novel using some of the things that you'd learned?
What it was, Vaseem, when you write an academic book, it costs 50, 60 pound. And nobody wants to, you write you spend years writing this 100,000 words for it to be just in the university library. And they talk about impact at the university, and you sit in your high castle and there is no impact. So for me to have, this important knowledge in the world was people, connect with the characters. And like you said about the antagonist, about the antagonist only is the antagonist for a reason. And I think it's, for me, it was taking this. I was told that novels are not supposed to be written with the to educate people, but I disagree. I think if you're articulate enough and intelligent enough, you can weave that moral compass through your novel. And I think that's why I was motivated to write, because I thought, and what's really exciting is that I wrote to the dean, and it's going to be on the syllabus. It's knocking Sherlock Holmes out of
Sherlock Holmes has been booted out the door.
Yeah, and it's going to be on the syllabus in September, and I think that's...
I'm interested in your process, because did you start with baby steps and do short stories first, or did you dive straight into your first...
No, when I wrote my first novella is called Escape from Syria, and I wrote that again. I used to teach ESOL, English to speak some other languages, and I wanted to raise awareness of why refugees flee from war-torn countries. Right. Okay. So I just went away and wrote that. But then what I realised is there's an assumption that creative writing is just a skill, a talent, but actually it's about honing that talent.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
So then I went on to do creative writing masters. I wanted to be the best at what I did, and I didn't want it to just be commercial, with no disrespect to commercial writing, but I wanted it to have literary merit
and meaning.
Yeah, and it was incredibly difficult. 7 years of research and 5 years of writing, and then making sure that there was no anachronism. So if it's set in 1915, I've got to make sure there was no mobile phones, and getting the details of Gandhi's, for example, journals. And then I had to send the novel off to a professor. And I was extremely, conscious of sharp-eyed historians maybe, picking me up on certain events, but it passed the book. So
that happens to me all. Happens to me all the time.
So so I think when for me, it's education and writing are the two. They kind of are the same importance to me, because when you do a job, you talk about social justice, and that's what my journey is about when I teach. And when I write, it's about raising awareness of important issues. Otherwise, I don't think you should become a teacher if you don't really have that passion to want to make an impact. So money's never been the biggest incentive in my life, having an impact on people and helping people, like you said. I think, and most writers have that intention, because you don't necessarily always make a lot of money. So
I mean, if I told you my origins, right? Because I know you've got your father and your family here, and clearly they're very, very supportive. When I was 14, I knew I wanted to be a writer because I loved books and fiction. And I wrote my first novel age 17. I was reading an author called Terry Pratchett and his Discworld novels, and I thought, I loved them, but I thought this looks really easy. I can do this. So I wrote a comic fantasy novel, 120,000 words, probably too long. And then I went to my parents and I said, well, I'm not going to university. I'm going to be a rich and famous writer, and I'm going to send this off to agents. And you can imagine what Asian parents back then thought of that. You see the way she's laughing? That's pretty much how my dad was laughing when I suggested this to him. Anyway, the book was rubbish, so I got rejected by agents, and I did have to go to university. And I don't regret it. I became a management consultant, and it took me out to India and China and all sorts of wonderful places. And the only reason I can write about India today is because I went out there for work, and then I was able to do it. But when you talk about history, I mean, I'm a historical crime writer, so I spend a lot of my time doing the research, and it's a supremely fascinating period. I mean, I'm 5 books into that series now, and the characters evolve, but the history, each time I do the research, there's something new to talk about. The 4th book in the series, for instance, it's called Death of a Lesser God, and it's about themes that I think are still very, very relevant today. So it's about a white man who was born and grew up in India, James Whitby, who is convicted of murdering an Indian nationalist lawyer, but he says he didn't do it. He says he's the victim of a form of reverse racism, that he's being blamed for the sins of his ancestors during the Raj. And so my characters, Persis and Archie, have to figure out whether or not he committed this crime, because there's 11 days left before he's going to be hanged. And the story moves from Bombay, and then it goes out to Calcutta, which was the first capital of British India. And I get, my books sell around the world, and I get mail from lots of different people around the world querying some of the history because they can't believe that some of the things that, because I try and take lots of things from that really happened and use them as a way to frame plot points. And people often write to me and say, is that true? Did that really happen when the British were out there in India? But the one thing I always say, which people don't realize, is that not all the Brits left in 1947 when India and the subcontinent became independent. Tens of thousands remained because they were born or grew up there, or because they couldn't imagine coming back to cold, wet, miserable England without their servants and their drivers and the rest of it. But also, the other thing I say is that not every Brit who went out to the subcontinent was a sinner, and not every Indian was a saint. And the reason I say that is because many Brits went out during the Raj because they were told that this is a way to make a living. You know, if you're a young Brit with some education, you're told that if you go out to India, you have a job in the Indian civil service or other careers, and you can make your fortune out there. Others went out there on Christian missions. You know, you can debate the rights and wrongs of doing that, but they went out there because they thought that they could help what they considered a lesser population. And again, you know, we can debate the rights and wrongs of their thinking, but they essentially went out there because not to colonize, but because they wanted to do something charitable for their fellow man. And when it comes to Indians and or Pakistanis or whatever you want to call that, the period people from that space, 1 million people died minimum during the partition riots. And although the British were culpable in allowing partition to happen to a great deal, it was ordinary civilians who were killing each other. Muslims, Hindus, and Sikhs. They're the ones who killed each other. Often they had been neighbors in neighboring villages or neighbors on the same street for many, many generations. But they were inflamed by the rhetoric that was moving through the region at the time, and it led to so many deaths. So I think growing up in this country, but then living there for 10 years, it gives me a slightly different viewpoint, because you were talking earlier about how the fact that you only had one viewpoint. There was never the South Asian female viewpoint that was being presented. And
I think for me, that's the point, what you're saying about the idea that you wanted to feel a sense of belonging in a place that you're born, being born British, but always feeling a sense of rejection, as though, you know, you don't really belong here. So I think that kind of led me to want to research why we were here. And then I learned that we're only here because Britain was there first. And I think it's that identity. And I think a lot of young, you know, British born, second, third generation, you know, whether you're from South Asia or whichever Commonwealth country you hail from, you're trying to find that identity and sense of belonging. And I think that's kind of been a driving force for me, in order for me to also kind of want my children to feel a sense of belonging. And that's why I dedicated this book to my daughter, because I want her to understand that, you know, there are, you know, I remember being young and watching, you know, East is East. That was the kind of representation of young. And these two young boys are forced to marry these two, you know, not very attractive young girls. And the story has just kind of always been stereotypical victimhood trope, which has been thrust upon us. And even my research, the Victorian feminist movement, you know, was quite complicit in those narratives. So I think that, you know...
Well, thankfully, I think it's moved on now. But 20 years it's taken. I mean, I tried for 20 years to get published and I couldn't. But in the last decade since I have been published, I think the industry has certainly moved on, or the creative arts in general have tried to move on, but there's still a lot of work left. Now, Scotland is going through a phase now with these elections where you've got called for independence once again, and promises of independence being made to happen if certain parties come into power. And I mean, how does that, you know, your books, do they focus on identity in any way, or is that not a big thing in your series?
No. I'm not particularly a fan of the drive for Scottish independence. I like to think of myself as both Scottish and British. So I'm presuming that Lorimer and his cohorts are exactly the same. Unlike my co-founder of Bloody Scotland, which happens in Stirling every year, Vaseem's another guest this year. My co-founder, Lynn Anderson, another crime writer, is fervently Scottish nationalist. However...
But you're good friends.
Oh, we're excellent good friends. We never talk about politics. Yeah. But I think one of the things that I'm really happy about in this book is portraying a country that I knew so well and a country that's undergone drastic changes. You were talking about using real aspects of history in your book. I use real incidents that happened in my own life. When I was out in safari, when I lived in Zimbabwe, places in Harare, places that I knew. And I really enjoyed these little aspects. And when the reader reads it, they've no idea that, yes, it was me up in a tree house in the dark, hearing something, possibly climbing up, might have been, something that might eat me, and turned out to be a bush baby. There were some lovely little tales in there. And of course, you can spin and you can weave the story around things that really happened to you. Although I started writing when I was about 8 years old and had my first publication when I was 9, that's another story. Do you remember, any of you remember the Bunty comic? Yeah? Well, I had a letter, age 9, in the Bunty comic, and they sent me a scarf, which I never kept, unfortunately. So I had been writing from the time I was little, but I didn't have my first novel published until I was 52. And it didn't take me 20 years. It maybe took me about 3 or 4 years. It was the 12th publisher that I tried that took me on, Canongate. I'm now with Little Brown, have been for a long time. But it took J.K. Rowling 13 shots before Bloomsbury picked up Harry Potter. One up with her. But I think it was important to write this book to show that there is hope for the people who are there. Some of the dreadful things that happened to friends of mine who remained in Zimbabwe under Mugabe's regime, it was just shocking. The corruption was just awful, as happens, I'm sure, in many African countries. But this was a country that was dear to my heart. And I've now got, as I say, I've got Daniel Cohey. He's now gone through the Tullyallen, which is the Scottish Police College. Anybody, even if you've been a senior officer, if you come to Scotland, you have to retrain and start at the beginning, go through your probation. So I've got him doing that. There's actually one little bit in here that I love, and that is Daniel is in Glasgow in a police office now as a police constable. And one of the things that sometimes police constables have to do is to steward football matches. And Cathcart, where he's based, is very close to Hampden Park. And I have a fictional English-Scotland friendly match, and Andy Robertson scores the only goal. He's the Scottish captain, by the way. So one can do it in fiction, even when you know it's not going to happen in reality. So it's funny, all the wee things that you like can be woven in. So I've got the Glasgow, which I love, and different aspects of Glasgow, different parts of Glasgow are in the story, and Zimbabwe, very, very big part of Zimbabwe comes into the story and ties together.
Fabulous. Now, Sarah, did you have to go and do some on-location research?
7 years of research. So I remember at one point I had to get Gandhi's journal sent from India to London and to Huddersfield University. So there was a lot of oral history as well, a lot of interviewing. But yeah, there was a lot of research involved. At one point, the women in my novel go on a trek across all of northern India. And I wanted the novel to be kind of based on this trek, 75 trek, based on the Chipko movement, the women who actually traveled and who embraced the trees. And it was just, it took me ages. I had a massive map on the bottom floor of my house of all of northern India and all the places which would, it's 75-day trek where I would go. So I feel like I know North India better than
Did you do the trek?
Yorkshire. I didn't travel there to do it. No, I had to plot and plan the fiction from home.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Gandhi's one of those figures who's going through a reappraisal in certain parts of India, which is quite shocking, I guess, because
I've read The Doctor and the Saint.
No, I haven't, but I know of it. I know of it, and it's quite a shame that people are willing to throw mud at him just because it suits their current narrative.
But I feel like if you ask the wife of Gandhi or Martin Luther King or Malcolm X, quite often the people that we celebrate, the people know them as one face. I'm very cautious about my work I do outside and how I am with my children, because it's one face you show to the world when you're trying to save the world, but the people at home, they will see a specific face as well. So, only Gandhi's family really know what he was like at home.
But isn't it that old saying about, if you devote your entire life and energy to a cause, necessarily other things are going to fall by the wayside, and it's usually your family that has to suffer. You can't do both, probably. I mean, some might have managed it, but you're absolutely right. A lot of people.
We are all complex characters, aren't we? There's no
There's only so much energy and time in a day. If you're going to spend your entire day trying to get rid of the British from India, something's going to have to give.
It's interesting you say that, because my first character, Barraj, is just obsessed with Gandhi, and he's wanting his daughter to say Bapu. She's trying to learn the name. And I think for me, what was interesting when I first kind of discovered writing was understanding that there's no just good and bad characters, that we're all complex. We all have imperfections, and that's it's quite an interesting.
That's what makes crime fiction so, because the very best crime fiction is very much about characters that a shade from light to dark and back again. They're not one-dimensional. That's just bad crime fiction if they happen to be.
And for all that we are globe plotters in these particular books, what we're really seeing wherever we go is humanity.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
People are the same the world around.
Yeah, and some of them are absolute arses, and some of them are wonderful people. I mean, my favorite Gandhi quote is, so you've all heard the saying, the sun never sets on the British Empire. So Gandhi famously joked once that that's because God doesn't trust the British in the dark, which I thought.
I'd never heard.
I mean, he was a very funny guy. He had lots of British friends, and one of the reasons that he had that, because he trained as a lawyer in the UK. Then he went to South Africa, where he was booted off a train, which he didn't really like very much, and that set him off on his path. But he maintained very cordial relationships with most of the Brits that he had to interact with through this very tough process of trying to convince them to leave the country. And he was always adamant that if I try and impose my will on these people, one, it's not going to work, but secondly, I will alienate the very people who have the power to do something about the change.
And I think what you're saying about humanity, I think that is so important. I think for me, lived experience is so important. And I think quite often, in order for us to be compassionate towards other people, we have to understand that people are influenced by their lived experience. And if we don't necessarily understand that lived experience, that doesn't kind of give us a right to judge that. So I think it's all about understanding people's.
Yeah, you're really right. I remember when I was first published, and I was older than I expected to be when I was first published as a novelist, and I said to them, do you not think I'm too old to take on? Oh no, they said, you've got a lifetime experience to bring to these books. And it's absolutely true. And I've found that, and you do use the things that have happened to you in your own life in creating your characters and creating situations.
I'll give you a perfect example of that. So the second book in my Malabar House novels, it's called The Dying Day. And that book took 20 years. Not to write, but the initial idea for wanting to do something, and then it took 20 years before I had this series, and I thought, oh, great, I can use that idea in a book. So there's a place called the Asiatic Society of Bombay, in Mumbai, as Bombay is now known. And it's a 200-year-old building that the British built, and it's packed full of treasures, a lot of them from Europe. So you've got a Shakespeare First Folio, you've got a Voyages Around the World by Cook, but you've also got a 600-year-old copy of Dante's The Divine Comedy. It's one of the two oldest in the world, apparently. And it's a real thing. And Mussolini tried to buy it in the 1930s for $1 million, or the equivalent of $1 million. And the Indian government rightly said, well, get lost, we're not giving this back to you. You Europeans have stolen enough of our stuff, so we're going to keep this. And so in The Dying Day, this priceless treasure goes missing. And Persis and Archie, my protagonists, have to go and find it, and bodies pile up and all sorts of things. I actually visited that place when I was living in India, and I was just absolutely wowed by these artifacts and the fact that all of this history had come from around the world and had ended up in this museum that the British had built, which I always thought was quite ironic, because they were busy stealing stuff from all over the world and bringing it back to the British Museum and all sorts of places. And here they were bringing stuff in, and it's making this fabulous journey, and I could use it in a plot for a crime novel 20 years later. Crime fiction. Let's talk a little bit about earliest inspirations. I mean, what were you reading in terms of crime, mystery, thriller, fiction early on, or even now? Where's that journey taken you guys?
What was I reading early on? Well, I think in my 20s and 30s, I was reading the golden age of crime fiction for sheer pleasure. Nowadays, I think some of my favourite writers include Mick Herron, definitely Alexander McCall Smith, and a Canadian writer called Louise Penny. who writes
Fabulous
beautifully
author.
about the Quebec area.
The Gamache novels.
Gamache novels, absolutely beautiful. I read a lot of crime fiction. I do a debut panel at Bloody Scotland every year, so publishers tend to send me between 60 and 100 debut novels every year, which I read, and I have to, out of them, chose 4 best. I have to say I'm very pleased about my track record, because many of my debuts have gone on to top 10 success and film rights, etc. So it's a good thing to do. You're bringing on the next generation.
Yes.
So I do find myself steeped in crime fiction.
So the lesson here is, if you're writing a crime novel, send it to Alex. Right.
via your publisher.
No, we'll post our home address up there in a minute. So. What about yourself, Sarah?
What's interesting is when I was doing my PhD and I started writing, my supervisor told me that my antagonist needs to be really, someone who really kind of, gets on your nerves and who you're kind of appalled by. So he told me to go watch the whole Epstein series on Netflix.
Okay.
So I actually was watching all of these crime documentaries and, people who had kind of, how did they become the antagonist, and how did they become...
But that's the amazing thing about crime thriller fiction, that often the nastiest characters are the ones who compel our attention. And sometimes the protagonist obviously is the protagonist, but it's often the antagonist that...
Absolutely. Actors would much rather play Iago than Othello.
Yeah, and the perfect example of this, and I'm sure there can't be anybody in this room who hasn't either seen The Silence of the Lambs or read the book, and it's a perfect crime novel. And it's made perfect not just by the character of the young FBI agent, Clarice Starling, but Hannibal Lecter himself, who is, for me, one of the most likable characters in crime fiction. That's a very odd thing to say about a cannibal, but when you read the book or if you see Anthony Hopkins' portrayal of him, he's always got a twinkle in his eye. He's got charm. He's unbelievably erudite and learned, and he's steeped in knowledge, and it comes out in the books, less so in the films, but we get an idea of how sharply intelligent he is. And he's wicked. And we often like really wicked people when they're at a distance and we know they can't. I mean, I wouldn't like him so much if he ate my liver, but as...
Yeah, I think that's true. And obviously we don't want our readers to know who done it. We don't want you to know the identity of the killer. So we're sometimes going to mask that behind a facade of charm or erudition or just sheer attraction.
Yeah. So I'm going to open the floor to questions in a few minutes. But before we do that, what are we working on next? What are our next projects? What do we start with you, Sarah? What's going on?
I really want to write a memoir.
A memoir?
I really want to write a memoir, but at the moment I just want a break after all of that PhD. After PhD, I think
novel.
When you're writing, I think for me, I think you have to feel it. You have to really, if you're passionate about something, then you put a lot of time and effort into it. So that's what I would really like to write, a memoir.
Okay, fabulous.
Well, I'm nearly finished book 22, and it's going to be set around fictional theatre. So it's a theatre world, it's actors, and also involves Lorimer's goddaughter. Mm-hmm. He and his wife Maggie have never had children, but the forensic psychologist, Professor Reitman, and the forensic pathologist, Dr. Rosie Ferguson, early on in the series, they get married, they have children, and they have these 2 godchildren. So the goddaughter is partly instrumental in the plot beginning. And it's been really fascinating, because particularly with actors put on a mask. I've done some acting much earlier in my life, and you create another persona, something you can hide behind. Mm. So I find the whole aspect of appearance and reality fascinating. I was able to delve into that even more with this book.
And also, I think crime fiction writers in book and on screen quite like killing actors. I've discovered that anyway. Sorry, I play a cricket match for a team of authors, and every year we have a grudge match against a team of actors. It's supposed to be a friendly game, but oh my gosh, the level of vitriol. No, I joke, of course. They're all lovely. Really.
Do you always win?
No, actually, they thrashed us 3 years in a row. So
that's terrible.
Great.
Come on, crime fiction authors.
So,
how about yourself?
Okay, I've forgotten the question.
What are you working on?
What am I working on? Oh, okay. So the 5th In the Malabar House series comes out. That will be my 10th novel because I had a series of 5 books before that in a modern series set in India. So that's called City of Destruction, and that comes out this November. Then I've got a psychological thriller set in small town America coming out next year, and then I have a different series that's also, I have a very busy schedule for the next few years.
You are a busy person.
I think it's better to be busy than to be not doing anything. I think my wife doesn't always agree, but because especially since I waste half of my summer playing cricket on Sundays when I should be sitting and writing and doing things with her. Right, I am going to open the floor up to questions now. So we have some hands up. There's a lovely lady coming around with a mic.
Hi, thank you so much. I just wanted to ask Sarah particularly, you said you did an MA in creative writing. How do you think that's helped your writing, helped to develop you as a writer?
I think it showed me about technique. Basically, you go through the whole show, don't tell, how to write a plot, how to write good dialogue, how to find point of view. It completely shows you how to write, basically. I always think that creative writing shouldn't be called creative writing. It should be called technical writing because, there's so much to it. And, I kind of, when I'm helping my daughter write, even just Key Stage 3, when they even show you them skills, show, don't tell. But I feel like it's lost as students progress. So I think the masters definitely does stretch you, and you can either focus on whether you want to focus on creative non-fiction, whether you want to focus on fiction, whether you want to focus on script. It's up to you to specialize in the area that you feel you want to specialize in. And obviously for me,
and don't most of those masters ask you to do a dissertation at the end, which is essentially the beginning of a novel? Is that right? All right.
It could be anything. It could be a script,
or the piece of writing that you might want to write,
whether you're
to see published.
Specializing in
So,
poetry.
and that's done with supervision. So it's a really good way of getting constant feedback.
Yeah.
So if for instance you did want to do a novel, it's a great way to get the first 20 or 30,000 words or whatever it is with regular feedback and to tell them.
And obviously you have your mentors, your supervisors. So essentially you get, like Vaseem just said, you're getting that feedback. I mean, it's not essential to write. You can still go away, you can still write without it. But for me personally, I wanted to do better. So
it's a shortcut to learning the skills. So when I was young, there were no such courses, at least none that I could access or had any awareness of. And I do wish that they had done something like that, because I wrote a lot, and I think that's the first key. You have to write a lot. I wrote 7 novels and lots of half-finished novels before I was eventually published, and the early novels were really bad, and you can see that they were really, really bad. But by the time I got to my 4th or 5th after a decade, the responses I was getting from agents were, "We quite like this, we like the writing, but we don't. It doesn't suit what we need right now. So send us the next thing." The best exercise I did to try and improve my skills, in my 30s, I made a list of 100 of the greatest novels of all time. So I took them from Booker Prize winners, Pulitzer Prize winners. The Times has a list of the 100 greatest novels. The Independent has a list, and I just picked out 100 that looked interesting to me. And you've got books like Ulysses and all the way down. And I spent 5 years reading those books and making lots of notes as to what might have made these books work. And it was just the best lesson. It's the best lesson that you can get, because you won't like all of the books. Some of them you'll think, well, this is nonsense. How is this on the list of 100 greatest books ever? But over the course of it, you will see a range of styles and ways of writing. But you'll also see books where you get it, where you understand why it was that this book is considered a classic. What sets it above, and usually it's quality. It's not just prose, ability of prose, but it's about setting. It's about being able to evoke period and creating great characters whose journeys that we want to follow through that.
But don't you think it is very subjective writing? Because when I was researching, I prefer a plot-driven novel to a character-driven novel. And I think everybody's... I remember my sister saying to me once, when I'm reading, sometimes it's just so slow. There's so much setting that I get switched off. So I think everybody has their... Because people who say we don't like reading, I just think it's because they've not been in contact with the correct book.
Absolutely. And so tastes also change over time, right?
That's true. And I would say... You don't have to do a master's. It's wonderful if you do. My daughter did. She got one with distinction. But reading, always reading. I think there was somebody else with their hands up, 1 or 2 folk.
Hi, I was just wondering if any of you had read the Ovidiu series of books. They're set in Singapore in the
Frangipani.
1930s. Yeah, 'cause-
Frangipani murder,
yeah,
etc.
yeah. Because I thought that's really interesting as well, because it goes from Singapore being under British control and then to being occupied by Japan, and how things affect all the different ethnicities and everything like that in that area.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of fiction around that space at the moment. And I think it's because we're still having those discussions today, right? We're debating how we should view the colonial era, or how we should reset and reframe some of these narratives. And some people want to pull down statues, and other people want to erase bits of history. I'm not such a big fan of that myself. I would rather see context put around that kind of history so that we learn from it, because if you just completely remove all of that, then clearly there's nothing left for us to learn from, and they can't tell, and we end up making the same mistakes.
It's not about removing history. It's more about discovering, or like the hidden history, what's kind of not been discovered. I think that's probably why a lot of because I hear a lot of discussion about this new woke community, and it's interesting because it's not that people are woke. I think it's people are now just talking about the contentious issues that perhaps weren't spoken about.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not about pulling down statues, but I am about decolonizing and finding out, researching and having more of
absolutely
an
that should be the
objective
key.
view
The goal
of
should
history.
be for us to be able to learn from history, but also to present history in a more balanced way than it's previously been presented to us. Was that a question or a 5-minute warning? Oh.
So this isn't quite as deep as some of the other questions. Vaseem, you mentioned you like Terry Pratchett. He's honestly one of my favourite authors. Just wondering, what authors do you guys look up to? Do you take inspiration from? And do you just enjoy reading?
Start with
Artists.
Yeah. What writers do you enjoy reading now?
My favourite book was The Colour Purple when I was growing up. Alice Walker's Colour Purple. I was just a young girl, and I just fell in love with her, just the way her narrative style, and I think that's.
But isn't that amazing? Isn't that amazing? Because we're talking about global perspectives, and you're an Asian girl from an Asian background, but you fell in love with a book which is about the black experience in America, which is incredibly far removed from us. But at the same time, there are some points where we think, okay, we went through some of that racism, we went through some of that prejudice in this country.
Yeah, I think the book that influenced me most, especially, I started reading it when I was 9. I'm still reading it. I think I've read it over 25 times. J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings.
My son loves it.
Absolutely adore that book. It's full of the most beautiful writing. It takes you into a different world. And that's what we do as crime writers. We build our alternative world, and we hope to draw you in and make you believe in that world. We don't have to write fantasy fiction to do that, but we do have to have credible characters. We do have to have an aim, if you like, maybe heroic people, and you do have to have this sense of evil, having to overcome evil. And Tolkien did that in spades.
And do you see how the world has changed so much in the publishing industry? Because we're contracted to do a book a year, and publishers get very anxious if you're not publishing a book a year in crime fiction, for instance. And in fantasy fiction now, they do these YA trilogies, and they've got to be banging out a book every year so it can be turned into a Netflix series or sold to Netflix or whatever. But Tolkien, I think, took 20 years to develop this world and this creation. And that's why it's so detailed and so complex and so real. Even though it's fantasy, it's so real when you get into it that you're just sold utterly that this place exists somewhere. And that writers are not allowed or given that time anymore.
I just admired him so much. As an undergraduate, I wrote to him and he wrote back to me, and I'd hoped to do
Really? You have a letter from...
I had a letter from Tolkien.
Oh my gosh,
and
you could have kept it. You could have auctioned it.
Yeah, I had hoped to go to Oxford to do postgraduate studies in Celtic studies. It didn't happen.
Wow.
I did something completely different instead.
So this is the 6 degrees of separation in action. So I can say I know someone who knew Tolkien. Right, time for maybe one last question, I think, before we have to wind up. Is there anyone who has a burning question?
Oh, come on, you've got to have one. This reminds me of when I went to Cornton Vale Women's Prison after writing my 5th book, and I said, any questions, girls? not a hand went up. And then I said, girls, you can ask me anything. And one wee woman at the back put her hand up. She says, Mrs., where'd you get your cardigan?
Where have you got your lovely jacket there? We should probably ask you that. And then we're going to have to ask you about your outfit, and then we're going to have to ask about my jacket. I think a last comment perhaps on why... So crime fiction is now the most popular genre in publishing, right, across the world. It just outsells everything else. And the next closest probably is romance fiction. Why? Why is crime fiction? Why has it become so popular?
We make sense of the world. We're going to be voting next Thursday. Sometimes that's the only thing we have any power to do. So many, we are powerless really in individuals to change society. However, in our crime fiction, we can make a difference. We can actually get justice for a particular situation. So vicariously, our readers can do that too. And I think that's one of the most satisfying things to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what do you think? Crime and thrillers? Because you're literally doing that with your activism.
Thank you.
With your activism.
For me, I don't just see myself as a crime writer, because I guess
you're an activist as well.
My novel is a historical fiction. It's a thriller. There's so many sort of, for me, it's not, because I was just listening to you talk about how you need to write one every year, but for me, I need time.
Well, you don't have to unless you're...
I feel like I need time to do that research and to really feel what I want to write. And I think I don't want to kind of just be associated with one genre.
Well, you can do a memoir next, aren't you?
Yeah, so I mean,
we look forward to that.
So I think it's but what you said about, I think that idea of wanting to see your protagonist just really kind of get to where they need to be and to be successful. It gives you, I remember finishing my novel and just feeling like a feeling of satisfaction that she won, and so I kind of resonate with that feeling.
And that's what we want to transmit to all our readers.
Yeah, I mean, Agatha Christie, for instance, is now sold, 2 billion books, and the number of Agatha Christie adaptations that are going on around the world in languages that she never thought about. I was with an Indian film director, doing a panel with an Indian film director at the British Library recently, and he converted an Agatha Christie novel called The Sitterford Mystery, into an Indian, a Bollywood version with dance and music, and it was called the Killing of Charlie Chopra or something. They gave it some different title, but that kind of golden age crime fiction written in that style, where it's all about the intellectual challenge and the mystery and the characters, rather than lots of people being shot in the head and that serial killer type thing, which is also still quite popular. So you've got such a broad church now going from one extreme to the other, and that's why I think crime fiction is just so popular around the world. And that is a good point for us to end on. We are all going to be outside up there signing books. If anybody would like to take a chance on our writing, we'd be more than happy. But thank you so much for coming along and spending this hour with us. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. The 2025 Bradford Literature Festival programme is now live. Visit bradfordlitfest.co.uk to discover the huge range of events on offer over 10 days from the 27th of June. Don't miss out. Book your tickets now.